Kelly and George Cables to the stage. So, brings you a little Q&A discussion. So I have some questions of my own, but of course you all are welcome. So if you have a question, please just approach the mic over here and we'll do a little.
I just want to invite, if you'd like to come up, Florette Morgan, who you've just seen in the film, and Angela Morgan are both here, and I'd love for them to come up.
A round of applause. So to get us started, tell us how, why, and how did you get drawn into Mr. Morgan's story and were able to tell the story?
This started with Michael Connolly, who is, you probably have heard of him, he writes mystery novels, and he often cites jazz, and one of his favorite people ever was Frank. And I've known Michael for a long time, and he knew I was a filmmaker, and he asked me if I would be interested in doing it. And I didn't know Frank at the time, and excuse me. So I went and listened to the music. I was immediately convinced that he was great. And but I needed to find a way to make the film, and so it just wouldn't be recounting this sad and rather too familiar story of a great artist who winds up in the depths of drug addiction. And the prison component was especially interesting to me, particularly because of the fact that there really was this San Quentin big band. So that kind of got me going, and somewhere along the way I got the idea to put the band together, these two amazing people in it, and it just clicked. That's where it clicked, and we went and did it, and that made the movie.
So we're joined by a couple members of the Morgan family. Welcome. Tell me, obviously, you guys have lived with his story all your lives. Tell us a little about hearing about this documentary being made and your thoughts going into it. Did you have hesitations about stirring all of that up? It takes obviously a lot to be able to deal with so much, but obviously a beloved member of your family. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was honored, truthfully, because from the time I married his father in 1967, he was getting in trouble. And when people would say, "How many children do you have, Stanley?" he would say, "Well, we have one." At that time it was just Angela. And he said, "And I have a son. He's in San Quentin, but he's the greatest musician in the country." And my entire 23 years, I heard him say that about Frank. So when I heard they were going to do his life story, I said, this is a tribute to his father. He always thought his son was the greatest musician in the country.
Well, it was really amazing that we found out that they were doing the film, because my mom had been hounding me for several years prior to ever talking to them, saying, you know, you really ought to follow up on Frank's story. You know, somebody needs to tell that story. You know, you and your sister, you're the only ones alive. He didn't have any children, obviously, and he and Rosalinda were divorced at the time. She said, you know, you really need to follow up on that. And I had been dabbling in booking bands in the music industry, and she was like, you need to do something. You need to do something. And I always said, even when I started my Facebook page like 4 or 5 years ago, I said, you know, my dream is to hopefully one day do a story. And then it was probably maybe a year later after I did my Facebook page that Rosalinda found me and said, there's a lady that is trying to find you to talk. She wants to do a movie about Frank. And I was like, what? And so it couldn't have been a better person, her and Michael Connolly. And I was very familiar with Michael Connolly from The Lincoln Lawyer, the book and the movie, and I was like, wow, I know was just amazing that Mr. Connolly had, I guess, had a speaking engagement with Frank only about 6 or 7 months prior to him passing, not within the year of him passing, I think. And they said they would work together one day. They, you know, he was very intrigued with him, and of course Frank passed before that. But it was truly, it couldn't have been designed better. We were very thankful, very thankful.
Thank you for that persistence. Yeah. And so again, any comments or questions over here? Otherwise, I'm going to keep hogging the show and hogging your time. Again, a round of applause here for the performance of this. So I'd like to hear from y'all for a moment. You know, you knew Frank for a long time. You were obviously, you know, inspired by him from a young age. Tell me about the weight you felt in the idea of playing a tribute concert to him and being part of the film to help tell his story.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an honor for me to be a part of this film, and musically, even to be with this man and playing with him, but all of these musicians who were playing are jazz greats, and just to be a part of it was such a thrill. And to have Frank's story be told, and I learned a lot about his life actually in this documentary, because I got to know him very well. We did talk on the phone every day, and before I even met him, I was a huge fan of his music. And he'd come to play at Sculler's Jazz Club in Boston, and I would go up to him afterward and say, I love your music, I'm a saxophonist, and he kind of knew my face, but it wasn't until actually I was 14, I did this program called the Betty Carter Jazz Institute in DC, and George Cables was actually a faculty member there, along with some other great faculty, and he heard me play for the week, and then right after that, you came with Frank to Sculler's to perform. And then George said to Frank, you should really hear this girl. And Frank, I think, vaguely remembered me. And he said, do you have your horn? I said, yeah, actually, I have it. It's in the car. He said, come on up. And I think I played like the whole second set with you. I felt very self-conscious because I was like, this is your show. But something just connected, and we just really, he became like my grandfather. And I forget where I was going with that. All that to say that I learned a lot from this documentary because we usually talk so much about musical stuff, and it's just a real honor to be part of this, and I think that he's smiling down right now.
I must say that speaking of smiling down, Frank had the opportunity to make his father proud by being interviewed on NBC on a documentary about Frank Morgan by Jane Pauley before his father passed away. His life story was on NBC, and he also attended his father's funeral and played over his coffin, Love Story.
Mm. So, Ms. Heikin, I'm curious to hear, you know, with him being such in the spotlight, with the documentary having existed before, what was some of the source material that you were working with? What was the story you knew going into it? And what did you feel like there's got to be more, or, you know, where did you feel like you needed to get in there and be able to tell? And then also, what were you surprised along that process versus what you knew going into it?
What I knew going into it was very broad outlines of child prodigy, drug addiction, San Quentin, comeback. So that was, you know, there's 4 acts right there.
Sure.
But I didn't know, and Angela and Florette told me a lot of this, of the deep background of Frank's life as a child growing up in his grandma's brothel, and this whole sort of demi-monde that black musicians were consigned to because of the racism in this country. That I kind of vaguely knew, but I didn't know to that degree. And then was able to put together with like Billie Holiday's story, that she very much had the same upbringing, and all sorts of things that clicked for me that were really edifying, and I really wanted to bring it out. And I also wanted to bring out the level of racism in the studio scene in LA for guys trying to record and weren't allowed to. They'd just be in movies, you'd see a black band, but the actual music was recorded by white guys in the studio, and they'd get paid loads of money, and the black guys would get $50 a day or something to be in it. There were just so many things like that that were revelations to me that I wanted to deal with. And the other thing that was very important was to try and understand drug addiction and what it meant to him and what it meant to so many people. And I think Ed Reed, who was phenomenal in this, was a real, he just went to the heart of it all the time. He lived it with Frank, and he was extremely articulate and went on to become a drug counselor, and he's a jazz singer now, and he sang with the band at the Grammy Museum when we showed at the Los Angeles Film Festival. It was really earth-shattering the way he sang, because you could hear his history in his voice, and it was something that I always felt with Frank's music, that I could hear all this in the horn playing. That's what made it so rich and profound. So I just was looking for everything that went into producing that extraordinary sound that Frank had.
Well, we're certainly glad that you did, and we're certainly glad that you made this film and shared it here with us. And I just want to thank you all again for being here. We're incredibly honored. And
One question.
we got a question over here.
How difficult was it to get a band into San Quentin?
Very. It took us close to a year and a half to get permission to get in. We started talking about it in August 2011, and we went in October 2012. Just loads of red tape and stonewalling, and I don't know. There were a lot of reasons for it, I guess, but it was real hard. But the result was amazing. It was. Do you want to talk about what it was like that night?
Yeah. Well, it was different. I mean, we were prepared the day before at lunch by some of the officials from San Quentin to let us know what to expect, like not to wear blue. But even more importantly, the first thing that one of the persons said was, we have a no hostage policy. You know what that means. And I think you saw some of the reaction, which means that if something happens and you're taken hostage, that they will not negotiate. So they want to let you know exactly what you are getting into, although the possibilities of that were really nil. But getting in there, you have to go through these gates. When you hear, first of all, the security, and all the guys were about 3 times as tall and wide as me. So when you walk in, you hear the clang and the security and some more ID and more security, and you get in and they gave us a little tour of the old dungeons that aren't used anymore. That were, when you go down, it was like going into a mine. Into a mine that was just pitch black. The cells were very, very small and tiny. And they let us know about the adjustment center where they keep the most hardened criminals, the people who like Richard Ramirez, and I think probably Charles Manson was there as well. Well, they didn't come to the concert. But there were people there who were at the concert, who were prisoners, and we interacted with them, and that was pretty interesting. They have their own television network and their own way of, it's kind of like a community there that they can kind of run if they get to a certain place. So it was interesting speaking with the guys. They were interested in who was playing, and they were saying, well, yeah, we've heard of Grace Kelly, right? We saw her on YouTube, and we saw you, and we're looking forward. They helped with the instruments and with everything. But there was the security, and just being there and knowing that they weren't leaving. if you weren't careful, maybe you weren't leaving as well. If you got mixed up with the wrong people. But it was, I can tell you that I felt changed by the experience, you know, going in. And I've played in other prisons before, but this seemed to be really serious business. So it was a very special experience.
Absolutely. We have time for one more question, and then we want to invite everybody to join the group here down at the lobby near the beautiful Baby Grand down there, appropriately. And so we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you hear about all these great jazz players, and I just wanted to know what set Frank apart and what was so different about the way that he played and the way that he could, you know, use the saxophone.
Well, he was very, you know what, I just was listening at the beginning of the film. Stanley Morgan was singing, and I was saying, you know what, Frank sounds like him. You know, he sang with the saxophone. You know, that's very important. He loved to sing the song. I've played with, you know, looking at this film, I played with every one of those guys that came up with Art Pepper, with Dexter Gordon, with Hadley Cowan. And all those guys are great ballad players. But Frank, really, you could hear it's the instrument for one thing, and the way he approached the instrument was as a vocalist, as he was singing, and he did play from his heart. So what you heard when Frank played was his voice singing that song, especially when he's playing ballads.
I want to add to that I experienced the fact that Frank was one of the privileged young jazz artists because his father was in the entertainment world, and he wanted the best for Frank at that time. It was his only child. So Frank had the best, like the music teacher, private music teacher, college at Los Angeles City College. And he was one of the privileged people in jazz that had that foundation, and he had such a personality and manners from being raised around his grandmother for many years, because she was a no-nonsense person from what I understand. So, you know, I think that a lot of that young upbringing had a lot to do with how Frank fared in the world. And that's why he was given so many breaks, and he was well-liked by so many people in spite of all of his faults.
I would say that's true. I can't argue with that.
Well, I want to thank you all again for being here and sharing this story with us, and thank you all for coming. And please join us down